On a winter afternoon, the courtyard of a medieval castle holds its breath. The walls are thick, the air is cold, and a column of German guards tramp across the cobbles with a wooden packing case perched awkwardly in their hands. The crate is stenciled with Red Cross markings and a lazy loop of handwriting. Medical supplies, urgent. Inside the box, someone is counting the seconds, rationing air, coaxing his heartbeat to slow while splinters press into his palms. The iron-studded gate yawns. Light narrows to a slit. The boots don't break rhythm. A hand slaps the lid. The laughter of a sentry skates across the wood, and the crate moves forward into the pale light beyond the inner wall. If the box goes through both gates, a man inside will no longer be a prisoner of Colditz. He'll be a soldier who has done something almost no one manages. He will have escaped 3 prison camps. Long before a pair of lungs fought for breath in a wooden coffin, Dominic Bruce learned to make himself small. He grew up in Derry, a tight-knit, working-class Irish family who taught him to keep faith and find humor in thin times. He was medium height and wiry, quick with his hands and quicker with a joke. When the world tipped into war, he found his way into the Royal Air Force, to the night-black cabins of bombers that droned toward glimmering cities. He wasn't a headline ace. He was something humbler and harder, an observer and navigator, one of those men in the dark, crouched over charts, coaxing a plane across a nation using pencil lines, a compass, and a prayer. The war found his crew over water and lightless land, finding their way between bursts of flak and the thin white threads of searchlights. There is always that moment when the machine that carries you suddenly ceases to be faithful. A cough from the engine. A shudder. The world rushes in. Fire at 11 o'clock. A wing dips. The instruments spin madly. The voice in your headphones is calm in a way that makes panic feel indecent. Then a blast heat, cordite, and a sky that has lost the pretense of order. They came down in the dark, men falling like ash, the earth rising to meet them with all the gentleness of stone. When Dominic opened his eyes, he was alone, wrapped in a parachute and a pain that muffled the world. He began to move because staying still felt like death. He didn't find his crew. He found hedgerows, fields, a church spire, and then a German patrol with the leather creak and short commands that would become so familiar you could hear them in your sleep. They found his papers, his maps, the little comforts a bomber command man carried to make sense of peril. He tried a few words in the local language. The patrol tried back with a language he understood perfectly. The angle of a rifle, the point toward the road. He was 26 years old and a prisoner of war. It's an odd thing to be a prisoner at your prime. Your hands still remember work. Your mind still reaches for the sky, and the walls hem you in like a stubborn joke. The Germans marched him and the others through villages, onto trains, across Germany's ribs to places with names that seemed to curl back on themselves. Spangenberg, Warburg, Sagan. Names, eventually etched into tin mugs and scratched into the undersides of bunks. The first gate to shut behind him hung under the crooked roof of a castle on a hill. Auflag Ixa H, Spangenberg Castle, felt like a fairy tale swallowed by the 20th century. Its turrets wore barbed wire like a thorn crown. The courtyard rang with roll calls. You could smell soup and coal and the blood of nicked fingers where men hammered and whittled and counted. To the German authorities, these were officers captured and to be treated, on paper, according to the Geneva Conventions. They had beds and soup and letters, sometimes from home. What they also had, under the conventions and under their skin, was the right, as they saw it, to make trouble, to try the fences, to run. There is nothing romantic about captivity. It's boredom wider than a field. It's the way silence makes your thoughts loud and unkind. They built their own salves. Theater productions. Makeshift universities where captains taught languages and historians read aloud, and mathematicians taught the calculus as though the universe's elegance could substitute for freedom. They made cricket bats out of planks and football fields out of whatever piece of earth the guards would tolerate. And in the background, as natural as breathing, they made plans. Some people are born escapers. They can look at a door and see not a barrier, but the wood grain and the angle of the hinge. Dominic wasn't the biggest man in the yard. He was certainly not the most decorated, but he found the others who felt the same pulling thread running through their days. At Spangenberg, he learned the grammar of escape. How to stand so you are there and not watched. How to hide a saw in a hollowed-out Bible and a tiny compass under a finger of soap. How to touch a fence just once to feel the current, and how to plan for it with a strand of rubber, a strip of leather, a way to cut and not die. You learn from those who tried it before you. You file information like a magpie files bright shards. A drain that stinks of river mud and iron. A guard who loves cigarettes more than rules. A laundry cart that leaves the walls daily without much ceremony. You learn what hunger does and what fear does not have to do. You sign your name quietly to an unspoken code. An officer's escape committee that kept order inside the order. You feel the first taste of a different kind of oxygen each time you test the bounds. It's there, in the shadow of a medieval wall, that Dominic Bruce decided he would not live out the war passively. He would strike his own line through the map. At Spangenberg, pretending to be reasonable men among reasonable men allowed something risky to sprout under the surface. The Germans put a premium on order. The prisoners responded with politeness that covered 1,000 calculations. The first of Dominic's escapes came dressed in that politeness, like a second skin. The castle's small hospital was a place of quiet theater. Illnesses at Auflag XIH doubled as opportunities, a legitimate reason to move through doors, to be touched less roughly, to be carried, sometimes, instead of counted. A group of prisoners studied the daily ballet, the laundry carts, the wagons that carried refuse out, the orderlies' movements with their white armbands and their little notebooks. It takes weeks to make something look inevitable. The tools were simple. A stretcher board planed smooth, trophies from bed slats, sheets stitched with cunning. There would be a patient, there would be orderlies, and there would be a working knowledge of German that went beyond Schnell. Dominic practiced the slow breathing of a patient. He rehearsed a cough. The two men who would play orderlies memorized phrases with the anxious devotion of actors, whose play is only performed once. He's contagious, step back. An officer feigns irritation. Another distracts with paperwork. A guard who enjoys being seen as helpful is a gift to any plan. So is a day when the commandant has visitors and pride is at stake. They moved late afternoon, the light already thin, the air clean with cold. Dominic's body on a stretcher felt like a lie that weighed more than any truth. They reached the laundry exit with a choreography that had been practiced to exhaustion under blankets and whispers. The guard at the Sally Port Sullen in his 20s perhaps looked them over and shrugged. The white band orderlies had stolen their authority and wore it well. They stepped out into a different air one without the smell of men packed together, and the world widened. An escape from a camp is two distinct acts. There is the getting out, and then there is everything else. Once a wall is behind you, the world becomes a hazard course. In that first flush of freedom, a man wants very badly to run. But running is a flare. Calm is what saves you. Dominic and his companions had a map drawn from memory and rumor. They had money that looked wrong to any shopkeeper who studied it too closely. They had forged papers that might pass in poor light. They had shoes that felt like ballast. They walked. They kept the road when someone watched, and the hedgerow when no one did. They slept in ditches and barns, moving at times when the laborers moved, and stopping when they stopped. If they came to a village, one of them walked openly and asked the banal questions of any traveler. Where's the station? A church? A baker? It was a Germany of coffee in enamel cups and the quiet of hardship, where women in kerchiefs stood with buckets and children watched silently from doorways. The prisoners' clothes were their own but ill-fitting. The set of their shoulders betrayed them. The first day lengthened into an evening in which the sky turned to tin. They made a station at dusk, the air full of the rust smell of iron and coal dust that clung to everything. The platform was crowded with bodies wrapped in fatigue. A Feldgendarm walked the length, his aggression a kind of boredom. Dominic, head down, listened to the clock, aware of how time can make a man visible. Their plan called for a night train, a change, a long walk through woodland that drifted dangerously close to the border. It was the sort of plan that never survives untouched contact with reality. At a corner, a boy pointed. He wasn't sure. His finger had the uncertain arc of a question. But the policeman took the cue, and the force of that attention snapped like a rope. The Feldgendarm reached, and the men scattered. An escape can end in a second no handcuffs then. Simply the fact of a hand on your shoulder. The gutting knowledge that the next days will be worse. Dominic ran anyway, and for a breath he felt the old body return. The one that was made for sprinting across a field with a ball, not crawling through wire. He dodged, stumbled, and a truncheon glanced off his arm. His two companions were caught within minutes. He made it as far as the shadow behind a coal wagon before a boot found him, and the world contracted again into hard voices and brighter lights. Solitary is an escape of a different sort. It seals you from the gangrenous boredom, but breeds a new madness. There is nothing to do but think and rehearse. They punished his insolence. 7 days in a cell that measured footsteps the way some cells measure prayers. A man discovers his appetite for small victories there. 2 splinters used to pick a lock in the mind. The counting of bricks. The days line up like buttons, and you tuck them away. It is almost a relief when you return to the noise of the camp, and the other men are there, the laughter harsh and kind. The Germans took note. Incorrigible, troublemaker. He had added himself to a quiet ledger. War also moved. The tide tipped. Russia bellowed in the east. The skies over Germany were no longer charitable. Camps became transfer stations in a longer pilgrimage. Persistent escapers earned transfers the way schoolboys earn house points. After Spangenberg, Dominic was shifted to Auflag VB Warburg. If Spangenberg had taught him ritual, Warburg would show him organized chaos at scale. The first nights at Warburg tasted of damp wood and the sourness of overcrowding. Thousands of men parceled into compounds that were meant for fewer. Here the escape committee had shape and teeth. They had bench cleats hidden in bed legs to forge into tools. They had wire cutters cut from files, wrapped with rags to stifle the sound. They swapped out tin-lid compasses that MI9 had smuggled in under the labels of shaving soap. For the men who ran it, escape wasn't adventure. It was a duty awkward, solemn, absurd at times, deadly serious always. It kept minds keen and the enemy honest. It also, if you were lucky, walked you out of Germany toward a place where the sky was bigger and no one called your name at roll call. At Warburg, the plan they nurtured was audacious enough that you'd be forgiven for calling it madness. The fence lines, the way they stapled men into rectangles, had a vulnerability. Towers watched, lights swept, but in the scene between compounds, a strip of blind ground offered a narrow sliver of hope. The scheme was called many things in the retelling. The Warburg wire job, the ladder run. What it was, in essence, was a deliberate charge into light and noise, where the only safety lay in speed and in overwhelming an order that believed itself unbudgeable. The night was appointed. Bed slats became ladders, lashed with tow rope and desperate competence. Blankets turned into shrouds to hide the glint of wire. Scouts watched tower routines until they could count a sentry's cigarettes in the dark, and knew when his conversation dragged and his eyes drifted. The men lined up with the bizarre good grace of people about to run at danger because the idea had had time to attach itself to their bones. Dominic stood among them and felt the hum that lives in a crowd before a charge. His heart learned a new rhythm. He had no illusions left about what came after, but stepping back felt worse. A whistle that had never existed on any official parade squealed. Feet hit earth. Ladders went up with clumsy fervor. The first men went over, spools of barbed wire tearing sleeves and skin, teeth gritted against the instinct to cry out. The searchlight swung, hesitated, found the wrong corner, then ghosted back too late to stop momentum. German orders cut the night. Machine guns coughed warning bursts into the air. For a crucial half-minute, the towers chose show over slaughter. That's the mercy of routine guns fired high while officers yelled for formation that could not exist. The ladders swayed. A man fell and was caught underfoot. Others leaped from the top rung and hit the ground, rolling, surprised to find their legs still worked. Dominic's hand slipped once, then found the knot he had tied that afternoon and clung to as though it were the rope around the world. He went over and hit dirt with an intimacy that made him grin involuntarily, a harsh, breathless smile that no one saw. There were 41 of them out, scudding across fields like shadows that had learned how to run. They broke into small groups and then into pairs, elation a dangerous drug beginning to wear off. Plans unfurled. Dominic and a companion moved southwest, the logic being that chaos would be thickest near the camp, and the net would be sloppy at its edges. They kept hedges, ditches, and a railway line to their left. A farmer's dog barked once then, after a stern hush, decided not to press the matter. In the far distance, a town set up a smear of orange to rub its night, and the land smelled of cut wheat and damp. Freedom tastes like sweat when you've earned it. He made it 2 days, and a spread of miles that would have been admirable in peacetime hiking. They ate raw onions stolen from a field which tasted like triumph and hate. Their forged papers said they were Belgian laborers on leave, their accent an oddity explainable by hunger. A forester stopped them. He had a rifle over his shoulder, and a skeptical take on the world shaped by years of watching men try to slide past the rules. He asked questions that weren't hard. He waited too long between them, which is when a liar trips. Dominic's friend faltered on a place name. Something in the forester's gaze hardened. It was that simple. The rifle shifted from habit to intent. The two men went to ground before the second sentence. Running when you're supposed to stand is useless at 10 paces. A shot cracked and went harmless. A baton found ribs. The joke ended. Recapture wasn't a surprise. It was a rhythm. Punishment came in a new flavor weeks in the quarantine block that smelled of disinfectant and curses. A ban on parcels, the small tortures of men who knew that the months of the war would be counted in men like these refusing the roll of cattle. Warburg had been a public embarrassment. Someone in a gray uniform decided that the worst of the lot needed concentration, not merely detention. There was a place for that, a medieval fortress in Saxony that had once housed counts and now housed the enemy's most inventive minds. The word Colditz in those days had the weight of a challenge coin thumped down on a bar. Dominic made the train with a guard at his elbow and a grin he didn't wear where they could see it. If you're going to put us all in one place, he thought, we'll make you proud you did. Colditz Castle hunkers on a cliff above the Mulde, its white walls like a clenched fist, its roof lines combed by wind. When you first see it from the river road, the place looks like a bad joke told by history. A fairy tale palace pressed into the service of a war that fed on efficiency and fear. The Germans held it in awe and irritation. They called it Auflag 4C. The Allied prisoners called it a challenge. The men who ended up at Colditz were a fraternity of trouble. They arrived branded as incorrigible, a label they wore like a medal. They were British RAF and Army, Canadian, Dutch, Polish, French, anyone who had made a commandant curse into his coffee more than once. Men in this castle wore the precise, impatient air of those who know they're being underestimated. The commandant, initially at least, embraced the old codes. Officers dined separately from other ranks. The Geneva Convention was waved like a talisman, but there was no mistaking the steel underneath. This was a place that understood reputations and wanted to end them. An escape committee ran the castle like an invisible ministry. It allocated scarce resources, study time on the roof for observation, a pair of wire cutters, the one precious map of central Germany printed on silk that had been smuggled in under the false bottom of a crate of nurses' gowns. It decided who would go through a tunnel first and who would stand watch. It hushed egos with the memory of the men who had already failed and paid. Each nationality had a culture. The British played at humor while taking everything deadly seriously. The Poles marveled at the luxury of time. They had survived their country's fall while still multiplying mischief. The Dutch were fine engineers. The French had a genius for distractions. They all pooled it. Dominic found himself both a small part of the machine and, over time, at the center of a scheme that would require him to do what he had learned in schoolyards as a boy: make himself small and wait for his moment. Colditz has been romanticized, sketched as a place where gentlemanly war met athletic ingenuity. It was that, and it wasn't. It was lice, thin soup, cold that crept into bones, humor hammered into shape to keep despair from colonizing the brain. It was also a university on a cliff, lectures on medieval poetry, on astronomy, on the rules of cricket, scheduled with a rigor that would make deans weep. The weight of idleness was distributed like rations. Behind it all, always was that itch at the edge of consciousness. Where, how, with whom, and to what end will we try next? It begins with a crate, or with the idea of a crate. Red Cross parcels were a lifeline. They arrived redolent of the civilized world: chocolate, cigarettes, tinned milk, things you could trade for favors, and on which you could build your sanity. Parcels meant packing cases. Packing cases meant measurements. Men with hands like carpenters and minds like locksmiths set about proving that a human being could be made to fit into an object meant for goods. The French theater troupe provided a cover for the noise. Rehearsals happened whenever something loud needed to be done. The Polish officers offered endorsements on the structural soundness of the plan. If you can hide 5 men at the bottom of a trench under a plank while a tank rolls over, they argued, you can squeeze one into a crate and carry him into daylight. The plan had a mad logic. Build a crate that matches the specifications of the outgoing medical supply cases. Make it with a double skinner lid that sits true and looks official, a plank that bows ever so slightly under weight, and a hollow where a small man can slide his shoulders in and breathe through pinholes, disguised as a manufacturer's stamp. Assign a man a medium-sized one, if possible, who can endure the gnawing claustrophobia, the way air turns sour inside wood. Arrange for the crate to be carried not by prisoners, who would provoke suspicion outside the inner gate, but by German trustees who could be co-opted with cigarettes and a sense of being part of something entertaining. Dominic had the size. He had the temperament and a control of his breathing that had been trained in the unnatural stillness of solitary. He had faith in his comrades and in his own ability to be, for long moments, a thing rather than a man. One thinks of heroism as action, noise, motion. Sometimes it's the patience to do nothing when every cell screams to do something. They rehearsed without saying that's what it was. He lay in a crate with the lid off while someone measured the arc of his ribs. His friend counted. Inhale for 4, hold for 3, exhale for 6, count again. He sang to himself under his breath the crude songs of barracks and the psalms of his childhood, sometimes in the same minute. The men around him threaded fine wire through pinholes and watched the puffs of breath disturb dust like a weather report. Don't cough, someone said unnecessarily. Don't panic, they laughed. Panic is a weather front all its own. They glued Red Cross labels over telltale seams. A German sergeant, happier than he would admit to be in a place of rules rather than mud and ruin, had begun to think that he belonged to the story of Colditz. He liked being the man who let them build sets for plays, who watched them fence in the courtyard. They aimed the plan at his vanity. The crate would be part of an official consignment. The theater troupe would put on a little display at the gate for the guards on the afternoon in question. The commandant enjoyed a diversion. All of this smelled like the thing it pretended to be, a civilization within barbarity. On the day, the air was sharp, and there was salt in the castle's damp breath. The yard gathered itself like a stage. Men moved in the studied casualness that meant everything had been rehearsed. Dominic slid into the crate, which pressed its limits around him with officious intimacy. The lid came down slowly, like a benediction or a burial. For a few seconds, he fought his body's instinct to throw itself about, the way a horse bucks a halter. He cheated his heart into a rhythm, tasting wood and glue and the wool of his own sleeve. Above him, voices were exactly wrong, too relaxed, too composed. Then the thump of boots on wood told him he had left the room and entered the corridor, and that the corridor has never felt longer. At Colditz, a crate could move out of the inner courtyard through a smaller gate, watched by a corporal who fancied himself observant. Then there was the outer gate, the one that looked down into the town like a jaw line. The first hurdle was the sallyport between yards. The corporal rapped the lid with his knuckles and laughed at something someone said. He lifted a corner too little for a proper inspection, just enough to convince himself that he had done his duty with style. The men carrying shifted their grips. Dominic lay convinced the world could hear his breath. The crate went forward. The inner gate washed him with the cold light beyond, and the first of two throats of the castle swallowed and gave him up. Even in the telling, the second gate is slower. Maybe the guard's attention snagged on a detail. Maybe someone further up the chain had a prickle in the back of his mind. One of the German NCOs stopped the procession with a bark. The routine came apart and reassembled itself. What is that? Medical supplies. Open it. There is a moment on which everything turns, usually disguised as farce. A polished heel caught the edge of a patch of snowmelt. A guard who had chosen to be irritable about the wrong thing, an improperly buttoned tunic, say, decided to pursue his point, rather than the unusual wooden box. And somewhere a small sleight of hand occurred, the substitution of one crate for another in the neat little drama they had rehearsed for this exact contingency. When the lid was finally pried up for inspection, it was a clearly innocent box that glanced back at them, bandages rustling under the inspector's fingers. The second crate, the one that was a coffin ever so briefly, and then a Trojan horse, had already shifted toward the wagons waiting beyond. When the box finally touched the slat bed of the wagon beyond the outer guardroom, Dominic felt something change in the air that no document can describe. Above him a different rhythm took hold, street sounds, not garrison ones. He wriggled just once to shift his weight where a knot had been grinding into his shoulder blade for 20 minutes that felt like more than a year. The wagon moved. The men around him had to look deliberate without looking rehearsed. They were good at that. If he had climbed out then and there, he would have been visible to the townspeople en route with their day, too bright and too grim to ignore. He waited until the wagon had taken a turn, until the castle's wall was behind him like a mountain he no longer had to climb. When the first chance came, a corner embraced by shadow, the lid lifted, and he rose into air that felt like something owned rather than borrowed. A small man stepping carefully from a wooden box into disreputable light is not an image that belongs to heroics. It belongs to sanity. He pressed himself into the lee of the wagon, ducked under, and when the driver spat and swore and looked back, he was already a shadow, joining other shadows in an alley that delivered him to the street. He had a civilian coat folded into the wagon. He slipped it on without looking like a man putting on a life. He knew better than to look up at the castle's white face. He walked, right hand loose at his side, as though he had a place to be that wasn't freedom. Crossing the bridge, he watched the river rather than the eyes of the policemen on its far side. When the first bend came where the road slouched toward the trees, he took it like a local and did not run until the trees themselves said yes. An escape from Colditz made you a myth in whispers before evening. By the time Dominic's absence registered in the roll calls and the guards started counting too hard, the prison was abuzz with the word, "One of ours is gone." The commandant did what he was supposed to do. He looked stern. He shouted in his measured way. He ordered searches. The German security officer, Reinhold Eggers, who thought himself a gentleman and liked to match wits with clever enemies, scowled and wrote something neat in a ledger. He had promised the world that no one leaves Colditz. That promise came with footnotes, of course, when they made films about it later. But in that moment, a lost man had a name and a body, and the castle felt it. For Dominic, the exhilaration of stepping out of a crate gave way to the long apprenticeship to the road that begins the second you are beyond the walls. Climbing, cutting, crawling, it's all a condensation of will. After, it's navigation and luck. He spent the remainder of that day and the night moving like a wary animal, through hedges and along the edges of fields. He had decided on a southern arc. Switzerland drew men like a kind of magnet. It was both legend and geography. The fastest way to friends was also the path most scoured by men who wore field gray and answered to a chain of command that bent towards cruelty the closer it got to Berlin. He carried food, a handful of chocolate and a packet of biscuits he had saved, as though hunger could be bartered with preparation. He carried wrinkled papers in the name of a laborer. He had a plan for when someone yelled at him, and for when no one did. For hours that first night, he moved under a moon that had learned to be both friend and betrayer. Snow held voices and footsteps. He stepped where the wind had scuffed the crust. The land in Saxony doesn't yield quickly. It takes a day's hard walking to make the map change in your head. He took shelter in a boundary stand of trees and licked snow when his tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth. The body is a simple thing when you allow it to be. What he did not know was how quickly the net draws close when the name Colditz is attached to an empty bunk. A policeman sees a man's face differently if told he is no ordinary jailbird. Wires crackled. The fell gendarmerie saddled up and rode the back roads with an appetite for being the story tomorrow. Dominic learned to freeze when the wrong shape crested a hill. He learned to nod at a man's gun as if it were a tool rather than a sentence. On the second night, he slept in the loft of a barn that smelled of hay and the dust of summer. He woke to find the dawn stretching like a cat across the floorboards and the farm dog breathing at the slats below. When he slid down, the farmer looked at him without malice and half-heartedly waved a pitchfork. Dominic raised his hands and chanced a story in schoolboy German. It almost worked. He made it 3 days. That is, in the accounting of madness, a long time. He stood in a copse watching a road that ran toward a town little enough to be unremarked upon in field reports. He had his jacket turned up, a cap down. He watched a truck, and then a police cyclist, and then perhaps he allowed himself the luxury of believing luck is a skill. When the motorcycle crested the hill, it carried 2 men, not one, and they both had the air of men who liked to be early. The second man let the first ride past, dismounted as if to check a tire, and blocked the path that Dominic would have taken without thinking. Little maneuvers like that are what make a man's heart sink. A ritual unfolded questions, the papers, the gentle tightening of the mouth that says the story you tell isn't quite enough. Running is ugly up close. He did it anyway, once more. They took him quickly. He didn't return to Spangenberg or Warburg. Colditz demanded its fugitives be returned to make a point. The point robbed that prison of something, the belief that it could seal itself. When they brought him back through the gates, the men in the yard did not pretend not to see him. They made jokes that made their teeth flash. They sang a bar from a song. That approval seeped under the skin and made punishment easier to bear. The Germans wanted dignity as much as dominion. They put him in solitary, 42 days of the kind of time that has no features. He measured Saturdays by the slight change in the duty corporal's gait. He learned the brickwork like a stanza. He shaved with water that had the memory of ice. He made himself a world, a spoon, the four corners of a bunk, the way the light traced the far wall. Out of that world men build good humor that does not break, but bends. The decision to try again was not a decision. It was the default. You might as well ask a river if it intends to find the sea. There were other plans, other veins of audacity that ran through Colditz's bone. There was a man who tried to stride out, dressed as a German officer with the right swagger, and was shot for his troubles near a gate that knew him better. There was the patience of those who moved under floors like moles, carving an inch of earth a night, and being intimately acquainted with the breath of the soil. Dominic threw himself into all of it, and into the more ordinary heroism keeping a man's chin up, keeping satire alive, disciplining hopelessness with mockery. If you're going to tell the truth about men who escaped prisons, you also have to tell the truth about men who didn't. Michael Sinclair, a British officer, became famous for daring and for his red hair, for trying to fool the Germans with disguises and the kind of chutzpah that would have embarrassed a magician. He died at the wire when an overzealous sentry made a line in the air into a law. Others waited for the wrong night and paid for it with bones broken, not by bullets, but by falls. Still others found their good sense postponed. If I wait, the war will end, and I will waste myself less. All these choices sit in the same room. The pressure to run and the pressure to live longer than your fear both count. Dominic's great escape would be a badge of a particular kind among those men. He had not just fooled a corporal or cut a wire. He had gone through those gates in an act so audacious that none of them would ever again be stopped by the words, "Impossible here." The castle learned from it, as castles do. They changed protocols. They watched boxes as if boxes could bite. Eggers, to his credit, loved a clever enemy against whom he could be clever in turn. He did not forget the name of the man who wriggled like a half-ghost out of his neat fortress, and gave him later the faint salute enemies learned to exchange. The war dragged. Winter landed hard, then softened. News filtered through like rumors of a distant relative. Stalingrad became a word heavy enough to slow things. Sicily flapped its flag, then Italy. The Americans brought a new appetite to the sky. The camp's geography shifted as men were moved, as guards rotated, as Berlin sent instructions that smelt of panic disguised as resolve. There were forced marshes in the east as the Russians pounded toward the Odra. Columns of men with blankets over their shoulders, moving like a gray river under a low sky, fences replaced by horizons. The theater in Colditz went on. So did the escape plans. So did the lectures, prayer, melancholy, hope, hunger. Most men did not leave the castle as opinions about its weaknesses. They left when other men in other uniforms told the guards to drop their weapons. Dominic was among those who saw liberation from the proper side of a rifle. When men in uniforms in a language you understand tell you to walk to the other side of a gate that you have studied for years, it doesn't feel like victory at first. It feels like a missed step. It takes a moment to deal with the absence of a problem that has occupied your waking thoughts and your dreams for 1,000 nights. Dominic walked out under a spring sky that had grudgingly forgiven the winter and found that the world had changed without his consent. Those who have lived under discipline, even a discipline they resist, find chaos alarming in a way most do not. He watched German guards become prisoners, and prisoners become a crowd that did not know whether to laugh or cry, or write letters that could not possibly explain anything. He came home in stages. A truck, a plane, a ship, a railway carriage that felt like a dream. The moment you set your foot on soil you had known as a child is supposed to be a revelation. It is more often relief, and then the slow ache of becoming ordinary again. Freedom is a demanding partner. Dominic found work where he could bear it, the shaping of young minds, a kind of labor that requires patience and repetition, and the belief that a boy can become a man you'd be willing to stand next to when the lists are made. He joked, because that's how he breathed. He did not make much of his past, because men who have seen themselves small in a crate or large at a fence understand that heroics decay quickly if you insist on polishing them every day. There were medals. There were letters that phrased courage in the comfortable language bureaucracies reserved for the inconveniently brave. There were those who remembered and asked him to speak into the soft wool of after-dinner gratitude. He did sometimes. He also watched as the war turned into fables, Colditz into a shorthand, and escape into entertainment. He did not begrudge it. He knew that a story that travels will always shed its heavier clothes. But he would have wanted you to remember certain unsubtle truths. That escape was duty, not sport. That to escape 3 times from 3 different prison camps in a war you did not ask for and did not leave until it left you is less about taste for adventure than about refusing to be the sort of person who accepts being caged. That ingenuity is a human constant. There is no nation that has a monopoly on it, and that in Colditz, men from nations at different points on a map built tunnels together and stitched fake uniforms together and sometimes wept together because fear is also a constant. That the rules matter. The Geneva Conventions might seem quaint to those who have never needed their threadbare decency, but Dominic lived under a war where one side pretended to honor them and sometimes did and sometimes did not, and where the memory of men shot for choosing to tunnel rather than to sit required that someone, somewhere, stand up and say the rules are not a costume. Those who never came home sit in the story like anchors. You cannot retell an escape without tasting the breath of those who didn't make it past the second rung of a ladder. You cannot ask a man to talk about a crate without also seeing the faces of the ones who never chose to try at all and did not deserve the shame the world sometimes put on them for that. Each man made the calculation that would let him sleep at night run and risk, or wait and live. Dominic's accounting fell on the side of motion. He would not have claimed moral superiority in that, only temperament. Why does a story like this matter now? Because captivity takes different forms, and we need to remember not just that men once saw wire and refused to accept it, but how they refused together, with good humor, with precision, by paying attention to the grain of wood and the schedule of stars. We live in a world crowded with easy sentiment and hard cynicism. The narrow path between them is paved with patient, competent defense against whatever fence your time builds. We need to remember that duty can be joyous, that discipline can be revolutionary, that laughter keeps a body warm when the cold wants to settle in your bones. Dominic Bruce lived into the quiet part of the century after his portion of noise. He taught, he married, he sat at tables with friends and poured another round and pretended the world had always been this safe. He did not forget. Men like him never do. He was asked, more than once, to explain what made him climb into a wooden box and demand more air with his heart than the box wanted to give. He would shrug and say something that made it seem smaller. Oh, we thought it might work. Under it was the marrow of the thing faith in other men, and a refusal to be passive. The soldier who escaped 3 prison camps does not sit in a museum case. He doesn't want to be trapped even on a shelf. He is here to be a reminder that the mind is a door, that even when the body is hedged about by stone and wire, there is a detail to be exploited, a friend to be made, a laugh to be shared in the face of something that insists it cannot be laughed at. If there is anything to be done with a story like this, it is to take it as a kind of oath. Pay attention. Refuse to accept the fence as the edge of the world. Build something with your hands and the strange, precise hope of other people. And when the crate is closed over you, whatever your crate is, and the air feels thin and the urge to give up knocks at your ribs, count to 4, breathe low, and wait for the moment when the world opens just enough to resume walking.